Welcome to the Growing in Grace podcast, where you can listen in on some casual conversation about the good news of Jesus without all of the inconsistent religious double talk. If you've ever struggled with feelings of hopelessness, guilt, and despair, or wondered if you're really right with God, it's time to discover the true freedom that comes with the gospel of unlimited and overflowing grace.
You have found us once again. Here we are, the Growing in Grace podcast at growingingrace.org. I'm Joel Brieseke, along with Mike Kapler. Growing in Grace? What's this all about? What's this whole Growing in Grace thing about? Is it about perfecting your works? There are podcasts out there, Cap, and there are articles that I have found. I have a Google alert that I signed up for several years ago. So every week I get an email that tells me when the phrase growing in grace has been found online somewhere. And almost always, it's an article or something that has to do with works. We are commanded to grow in grace, or growing in grace has something to do with growing in the works that you perform. Not that there's anything wrong with, we've never said, and we're never going to say there's anything wrong with works that are an outflow of the life of Christ in us. Our union with Christ. There's going to be works, and that's a good thing. But we're not commanded to do works. It's not like it's a legalistic thing. But so many times, what people think of as growing in grace is not what we're talking about on this podcast. We're talking about getting to know the love and the grace of God and letting your life be rooted in Christ himself, in your union with him. And knowing that it's not about your works, it's not about your goodness or your good deeds. It's about what he has done in and what he's doing in and through you. So anyway, to get that out of the way, Paul was dealing with this stuff. We've been talking about Galatians. And
more like towing in grace, like hooking up an oxen with a yoke or something.
Totally. There you go.
You'd mentioned that people can support us with bacon last week.
Yes.
Well, can you imagine? I mean, if Jesus were walking around here today and somebody had like a legion of demons in him and he was going to cast them out and they said something like, throw us over into those pigs over there so they can run off the cliff. And you and I'd probably be saying, no, don't do that.
That would be me for sure. There's a lot of good bacon in them there pigs. Yeah, them there hills, a lot of gold. Bacon is gold to me. I don't need no stinking gold. Just give me the bacon. Yeah. Okay, enough with the bacon.
Yes.
Fulfilling the lust of the flesh.
Look, we're in Galatians 5. We've been going through Galatians for a number of weeks now. Last week, before the program ended, you were talking about the fruit of the Spirit. Paul here is talking about if you were led by the Spirit, you were not under the law, 5:18. The works of the flesh are evident, and he names a bunch of stuff there that are not good. Everything from, whatever, adultery, dissensions, heresies, lewdness, and so on. Envies, murders, etc. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such things, there is no law. But on the other side of the same coin, remember what Paul said to the Galatians back in chapter 3? We spent some time on it. Are you so foolish? Because they were being deceived into thinking they had to jump into circumcision and other factions of the law. Are you so foolish, Paul said. Having begun by the Spirit, are you now being perfected by the flesh? So the flesh can be what Paul listed there in Galatians 5, some works of the flesh, which are not good things. They're rooted in sin. Then there are other things related to the flesh that may look good outwardly to the religious mindset, but the result is kind of the same. It's still part of the flesh. But the fruit of, and this is important to understand, but the fruit of, and this is the fruit of the Spirit. It's not your fruit. It's not my fruit. It's his fruit. I've seen people sometimes probably some who are trying to grow in grace, as you were referring to a few minutes ago. I've seen some who will kind of turn the fruit of the Spirit into sort of a list of new covenant commands. Where
Right.
we're now actively trying to pursue the fruit of the Spirit by the flesh: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. And yet it says against such things there is no law. So this isn't about you and me trying to dedicate ourselves to doing these things. It's the Spirit of God who abides in us. As you mentioned, I think the phrase God working through us, working his life through us. It's just different. This is a part of who we are. This abides in us, this fruit of the Spirit. Do we always see it manifested? Maybe not. Do we sometimes see the flesh manifested? Probably so. But that doesn't change the reality of who we are in him and what he has accomplished for us through a finished work.
And that also goes both ways. What you're talking about, do we sometimes see the flesh manifested in us? That can be what you were talking about, going back to chapter 3, or it can be what he was talking about here in chapter 5.
Both, yes.
It could be both. Not only if we do something ungodly that would be considered a work of the flesh, but if we're trying to be good in order to gain something from God, that's also a work of the flesh. It's all the flesh. And so what he's saying here, the fruit of the Spirit, is these things. Like you were saying, it's the Spirit's work in us. It's not like, and I've heard also people do this, that, this week I'm going to work on love, or next week I'm going to work on joy, or I'm going to work on peace, or I'm going to work on patience. And it's like no, that's not how that works. It's those are works of the flesh. If you're trying to do these things, the fruit of the Spirit, if you list them off individually and you're trying to do those things, it becomes works of the flesh. And I've heard people say, well, don't, if you pray for patience, just watch what you ask for. God's going to start putting things in your life that are going to make you be, test your patience. And that's not also, I don't believe that's not how it works. I'm sure there are testimonies here and there where people, I did that happened. But generally speaking, I'm going to say that's not how that works. But against such, there is no law. So Paul is trying to point out to these people, again, sticking, as we've said many times, sticking with the context of the letter as a whole. He's trying to show these people that it's not about living by the law. It's not about that. Get that out of your heads. Get that bondage out of your heads and out of your mindset, and stop trying to live by the law. It's by the Spirit. It's the flesh versus the Spirit, and it's the Spirit that you want to live by. And those who are Christ have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. He doesn't say this is something you need to work on. He says this is a fact. Those who are Christ's have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. If we live in the Spirit, let us also walk in the Spirit. So it's an encouragement to live as who you are, walking not according to the flesh, good or bad. Don't live by the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That's why you came to Christ. It's not about the law. It's not about the knowledge of good and evil. It's about walking in the Spirit. And that's really what this is all about. That's what Paul is trying to help these people to understand. In chapter 6, there's several things to mention here, but I like I just lost it. Let me find it again. Chapter 6, verse 11. I like what he says. See with what large letters I have written to you with my own hand. He's trying to emphasize, I'm writing this. I'm wanting you to, in large letters, I'm really wanting you to emphasize what I'm saying here. I really want you guys to get this. As many as desire to make a good showing in the flesh. A good showing in the flesh. See, again, the flesh is not just the bad stuff, but again, we mentioned how Paul was persecuted, and that persecution was because he was going against this keeping of the law and trying to make a good showing in the flesh. He says, as many as desire to make a good showing in the flesh, these people would compel you to be circumcised, only that they may not suffer persecution for the cross of Christ. So it's like they're trying to get these people to keep the law for their own sake. It's not even, in many cases, it's not only because they think justification is by faith plus the works of the law, but they want to boast in these people that, we got them to keep the law, and now we're not going to suffer persecution. Because again, the offense of the cross is that it's grace by faith apart from works. Paul was being persecuted because he was preaching that. These Jewish people did not want to be persecuted, and so they were trying to make a good showing in the flesh, and they were also trying to get other people to have a good showing in the flesh. And that way, they wouldn't be persecuted anymore, and all would be well.
Isn't that something?
Yeah.
I mean, that's really good stuff. The sort of thing that's really kind of easy to skip over, I think, for people who are just kind of trying to get their Bible reading in for the day, right?
Mm-hmm.
I just think it's kind of amazing what Paul said there. And I guess it's speculations. Maybe some have thought that Paul was dictating this letter to somebody, and they were writing it. And then Paul jumped in here in verse 11 and started using his own handwriting, maybe because he had some sort of infirmity or something. I don't know.
I think his typewriter broke at that point. So he jumped in with his large letters with his own hand.
They didn't have wireless keyboards back then.
Oh, I see. Wireless. Well, he was using an old-fashioned typewriter with the ribbon and all that stuff.
For those, they're trying to make a good showing in the flesh. What we were just talking about. The flesh can be ugly looking sometimes, sinful looking. Other times it can look really religious and, kind of impressive, but it's still the flesh sometimes. For even those who are circumcised do not themselves keep the law, but they desire to have you circumcised, that they may boast in your flesh. So this is going beyond. This is going way out there now, Paul. Paul, you're coming off the rails here. You're not only talking about us and our flesh and trying to fulfill the law through our own works, through our own fruit. But you're talking about people boasting in somebody else's flesh because you talked them into doing something that really, was based in law and not grace. But far be it from me to boast, Paul says in verse 14 of Galatians 6, far be it from me to boast except in the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ, by which the world has been crucified to me and I to the world. For neither circumcision counts for anything nor uncircumcision, but a new creation. Such good stuff. What he's saying here toward the end of Galatians 6 kind of reminds me a little bit of a different context, a different tone, but some of what he said in the first part of Romans 2 lines up a little bit with what he's saying here in Galatians 6. There are those who are under the law who thought that being a doer of the law was the goal. It is not, Paul said in Romans 2:13, it is not the hearers of the law who are righteous before God, but the doers of the law who will be justified. Again, there's the danger in a verse.
Right.
If that's the only verse you read in Romans 2, you're going to miss the landscape that surrounds it that shows it is not through the law that one is justified one chapter later. Paul is trying to make a point here in Romans 2, but you've got to keep reading to get to the point that he's really trying to make. It is not the doers of the law who are justified. It's almost as if he contradicted himself. And then there are those who want to judge others, but they themselves aren't doing what they're telling other people to do. So there's some parallels there between Romans 2 and Galatians 6, but again, sort of from a different context.
Yeah, I think that's it. I think one of the things that Paul really likes to point out to people, to the Jewish people especially, and again, because they had been under the law for all those years, and many of them had trouble shaking the idea that they no longer had to keep the law, and that Gentiles didn't have to keep the law. And he pointed out to the people in Rome, like you say in chapter 2, and to these people in Galatia, the ones who were troubling the Galatian people, they were the ones who thought, yes, you have to keep the law. But he was pointing out that even those who say keep the law, they don't even keep the law themselves. In Romans 2, therefore you are inexcusable, O men, whoever you are who judge, for in whatever you judge another, you condemn yourself, for you who judge practice the same things. He's pointing out to people everywhere that just especially Jews, that, just because you have the law doesn't mean that you keep the law, doesn't mean that you're a doer of the law. You have the law, yes, but you still fall short. That's the whole point. The people who are under the law, they still fall short. They don't keep the law. And so it can't be about keeping the law. It can't be about having a life where you have faith in Christ plus keep the works of the law, because nobody can do it. Going back to Galatians 2, at the end of Galatians 2, Paul had said, I've been crucified with, he says, through the law, I died to the law that I might live to God. I think that's a big key point in what Paul is telling these people. As a Jew, through the law, a Gentile couldn't have done anything through the law because they didn't have the law. But as a Jew, Paul, through the law, died to the law, he says, that I might live to God. That's what it's all about. It's having died to the law that he might live to God. That's what he's trying to tell people everywhere, to these Galatians, to the Romans, to the Corinthians, to the Ephesians. He's telling people everywhere that these people who are trying to get you to keep the law, they don't even keep it themselves. It's impossible. They're just trying to make a good showing for themselves. They're adding things to you that are only complicating things, and you were never meant to be under these things. You were never meant to try to keep the law. So let yourself be free of all of that pressure. Let yourself be free of all of that bondage. Walk in the freedom for which Christ has set you free, and let that be the, quote, the rule of your life. It's not about rules. It's about Christ in you, the hope of glory.
One other thing I'll add, Joel, as we finish up here in Galatians, you had mentioned something earlier about avoiding the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the tree of works, so to speak, the tree where people put effort into trying to make themselves more acceptable and right with God. Going back to the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians 5, something that may help you a little bit is that we're not the producer of the fruit, but we bear the fruit. Jesus said that he is the vine and that we're just the branches. We bear the fruit of the Spirit, but it's the Spirit's fruit. It's not our fruit. It's not based upon our effort. We just bear the fruit from the one who lives within us, and we just yield to that. So again, we're talking about fruit. So here's a play on words. We're not the producer of the fruit. We're not the fruit. We just bear the fruit. And this is what, when we talk about works are a good thing. We've said that over and over again over the years, but they're not our works. They're the work of God in us, working in and through us, and maybe that will help a little bit. Instead of putting all of your effort into trying to get yourself right with God, we are right with God, and now we can respond from that.
This has been Growing in Grace with Mike Kapler and Joel Brieseke, heard online through various internet sources around the world each week. Access past programs by visiting growingingrace.org. Share it with a friend and listen again next week for more Growing in Grace.